Now, how was that part that you did with Professor Yalcum on global public good? You like that? No. Did you like the part on global public good?
Yeah, it was good. Really helpful.
You have to speak up and try again because I'm old and deaf.
Can you hear us?
Better. What did you say?
I was saying that it was very helpful.
Good. Now, we are going to...
Sorry, Prof, can you share the screen?
Not yet. Quite soon. Wait a moment.
Yeah, sorry.
We are now going to talk about a different issue that justifies government intervention in health, and not only, which is related to I would like to share, but I cannot see the list. Can you see now the screen at home? I mean,
Yes.
which is related to a different part of market failures that justifies government intervention not only in the health market, but in general in the economic system. And as if you remember, all the part until now was mostly related to market failure on the supply side, which makes a good point for government intervention, which is related mainly to the existence of public goods, not only government, but those characterized by the condition that you already know. And on the same frame, now we look at those market failures that justify government intervention, which are related mainly on the demand side. And this is it's not a complicated task, but it's a bit subtle, and that you have to consider the fact that we now try to consider how some problems that we normally find a standard life, standard consumer decision, can affect the theory that assumes a rational, perfectly rational individual. So how can we say that in an individual who is fully rational and is taking his decision with the best of his knowledge, he is also assumed, everything when choosing, maximizing his utility profile. He knows everything is perfectly rational and take a decision, and he fails. He or she fails. So the situation, can you think of something like this? Can you see in your personal experience situations in which you as a consumer are not so happy of your decision in consumption profile of any kind? The point of failure, as in the demand side, is that the individuals, in that case, from a production point of view, which doesn't mean that government has to intervene, becoming directly the producer, or am I regulate economy or providing borrowing abroad or borrowing the goods, simply because we have cost conditions in the supply side which do not fit to the standard perfect competitive economy of such. Now, in this case, we are in a situation in which the consumer, which is perfectly informed, rational, and the like, fails in taking decisions. Can you think of a situation like this in your experience? No, you are perfectly rational and happy with your decision. The question is, you are a consumer normally in your life. You buy something in the market, whatever you want, given your budget, and we, as economists, we are assuming that all the individuals going to the market choose something simply because they, knowing everything, maximize their utility. For instance, you buy shoes like that because you have a given budget, some preferences, and you maximize your utility. And for this reason, you buy that shoes, okay, or whatever, the mask. Now, which is a strange situation in which you, as consumer, in all these conditions, you take the wrong decision and buy something that of which you are not happy. Even if ex ante, it seems to be the best thing to do. No idea. Nobody else goes, are you always happy with your decision of any kind? As consumer, I mean, because we are talking about consumption. If the market fails on the demand side, we look at consumers. As before, we looked at producers because we were on the side of production. And in that case, the government action was justified by some characteristics of the cost function, which are not exactly those who like the perfect competition model. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yes, are you satisfied with interest?
Speak up, please, because I'm deaf.
Depends on the situation, depends on the market, and depends on the different choices.
You should speak up because I don't think at all can.
I said it depends on many items. Our pockets, our opportunities, the accessibility. Our choices depend on these things, and of course we are not satisfied on every choice.
Yeah, but the point is that you said very items. Did I understand? What do you mean?
The pocket.
Pocket?
Our,
The budget.
The
you
budget.
mean?
The accessibility. Accessibility.
Acceptability.
Accessibility. The access to the things that we can choose.
I don't think I understand what you mean.
Access. Accessibility. Access.
No, but as soon as you can access, you are in the world of perfect competition. This is the point. The budget is not the point because the consumer is assumed to maximize his utility subject to the budget constraint. So it means that given your budget, whatever it is, you buy the best given that and your preferences. So you should maximize, given that it doesn't depend on the level of income, for instance. because given that level, well, subject to that level of income, you buy the best. You are optimizing. Okay, so this is not the problem. You can do the best given the budget and given your preferences. The access is not, if you think of being in a perfect competitive market, you are well informed and the market is complete, which means that any good that you want can be bought. It should not be a problem. Well, it can become a problem, not the access, because we are assuming as in perfect competition that the market is complete. So whatever an individual as consumer wants, he can find it in that market. There is someone who is producing that good that you want. So it's not a point that you can miss a good. Any other idea? You're always happy with your decision. I'm very happy for you, but sometimes it doesn't work like this. In which case it doesn't work like this? It depends on some characteristics of the good itself. In particular, two, which are related to the production of externalities toward other individuals, mainly externality from consumption to other consumers. And do another issue, which is known as merit good or merit wants, which makes, has to be linked to something like, merit and demerit good. If you look at in the web, what is merit good? What do you understand when I say merit good? Ever heard of something like this? Even at home, it's a question, it's not a rhetoric question. What do you understand if I talk about merit good? Any idea?
Are those good that have a functionality for the collectivity, so for the society?
Functionality means in your dictionary. What does
They are considered useful for the society.
good? But if you look in the web, you find that, for instance, government says that this is something good to be done, or demerit good means that is something bad to be done. But this is not a good way to look at the democratic system. Because, for instance, Putin might say that the war in Ukraine is a good thing to do. And I'm not so sure that the collectivity of a democratic system and it spends money from the budget, Russian budget, for making the war in Ukraine. So our point of view is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that of a democratic system where is the collectivity which has to decide which kind of good is good. So in that view that you might very often find in the web, you are in a certain way assuming that there is a superimposed government who decides instead of the citizen and the consumers. But we are looking at a market situation which works in a democratic system. And in this case, democracy means that the collectivity is in charge for deciding what is good for the collectivity. So we have to, in a way, reduce the extent of merit or demerit of a given good or services to what a collectivity wants inside a democratic system. And that can be chosen with a superior decision, which is often related to constitutional choices, not only a law by the parliament, which is taken under majority system, but under a constitutional choice, which means that there is a constitution which decides that something is superior with respect to or inferior with respect to something else. And this is quite important because, and it's not very strictly related to the government decision. As possibly you know, in democratic system, the government decides by simple majority. But in most, at least when we talk about very good, we are talking about something which found its origin at the constitutional level. And we will see how. But the story of the existence of merit and the merit good and external effect from consumption are those that, in a way, justify, at least in part, the story of market failure on the demand side. There is also another concept which is important, and is important from the consumer point of view. When I ask you, have you ever experienced any failure on your consumer decision, of your decision as consumer? For instance, you buy something that then you said, well, if I had known, I should have not bought that good. It might happen. Sometimes it happens simply because one is quite is thinking of something else when it's buying. But even when you think properly, there are a number of situations in which a consumer finds that the decision was not so good when it happens. In most cases, it happens when you are taking, as consumer, dynamic decision. It means that you are deciding today, ex ante, something that will be in use for you after a while of different length. The period can be short or quite long. And ex post, when you have you see the result of your decision, you said, this is not what I wanted. It's not the best I could do at that time. And it is the case that it can happen even if you took the decision at the best of your knowledge at the moment of the decision itself. For instance, this is the case of all those decisions related to, for instance, social welfare, and to be intended as public pension scheme, or is related to health as for vaccination, is related to research, is related to situation in which individuals, at the moment in which they take the decision, apparently they make a rational decision as per their knowledge, but after a while this is not the best one. For instance, we are in Italy, and in Italy our constitution says, so our constitution is an important document because it was taken under unanimity at the time in which it was written, and it informs all the legislative production of the parliament. It means that any decision taken under majority system by the parliament cannot contradict the constitution. Well, our constitution says that the individual contribution for pension scheme is compulsory. It doesn't say how big, for how long, but just says that this is so important, first that the Constitution consider it, and it put as compulsory for all the individual living in the country. When they work, they have to pay part of their wage for contribution for pension. Another issue is related to compulsory education for young people. This is another bit of our Constitution. It doesn't say that children have to stay at school up to 10 years, 15 years, 16 years. It changes over time. And it is changed by the standard legislation by the parliament. But the point is that the Constitution says that this is important. And it is so important that it's put in a document, the most important legislative document of the country, of a democratic country. What is the point of doing something like this? Someone should know the story. Why should a constitution, a democratic constitution, say that payment for contribution for pensions must be compulsory? What is the rationale of this kind of intervention? Or the right for health is compulsory? Well, I'm Russian. I'm an economist. I am Russian. So, given that we are talking of merit and merit good, which means maths in economics, I know perfectly that smoking, drinking alcohol is very dangerous for my age. So my life expectancy are very low because I smoke 40 cigarettes a day. I drink alcohol every day. I exaggerate. I'm also very distracted. So when I drive, I'm very dangerous. So every time I'm at the risk of accident. And given that I am an economist, a rational economist, I say, well, I don't want to pay my contribution for my pension. Simply because I know perfectly now, in this moment, when I'm working, that, well, given my life habits, I will not reach, say, 70, which is the age for a professor to go to be retired. So I don't pay my contribution, which are, by the way, very high, and so I would prefer to keep the money and spend in other cigarette, alcohol, and all the cards that I'm destroying there because I'm distracted. Is that a rational choice? Well, it would be because I'm rational. I know that I shall not live for so long time, and so I want to spend my money. But the point is that I don't know exactly what happens to me, and possibly I won't die at the age of 70, as expected, and the situation changes. And when ex post realize that, well, I'm still alive over 70, and I have some need, and possibly I'm not so good because I smoke all the time, often drunk, with number of car accidents. So I possibly need someone that look after me. And I said, well, if I had known that I wouldn't die, I would have not died. Possibly I had taken a different decision. This kind of situation is known as time inconsistent situation. It means that there is a kind of regret ex post when the result of the decision taken ex ante realized I am in the condition of saying that that was not a good way of choosing. And something similar occurs, for instance, for compulsory education for children, which again is something that is mentioned in our constitution. And why? Because in certain situations, quite often related to poverty or not very good economic situation, having children at home might be of help and help the economics of the family, of the household. Because, well, in the morning the children want to sleep and say, well, I don't want to go at school, I prefer to stay at home, I can be of help at home. And parents can be convinced that given that they are not so happy to go to school, it's better if they don't go, because they are mainly in underdeveloped countries. This is very common because children are used for even slight job, either at home or outside, or helps the mother or brother and sister or the like. So it might be easy, even easiest. The easiest solution is keeping the children at home. After a while, when they realize that children become men and women at the age of 20, 30 of their life, and they have no education, and they have not studied at all, there is a kind of regret of the decision, and again, ex post, the reasoning is the same. If I had known the effect of education on children, I would have taken a different decision ex ante, and possibly, in that case, parents would have decided to impose education for children. It doesn't mean that the Constitution has to say how long should be the compulsory education. For instance, in Italy, changes over time. For instance, and sometimes for different reasons, compulsory education in Italy was related to the universal suffrage. So the male universal suffrage in Italy was in 1912. And in that case, in order to vote, individuals were expected to be able to show that they could read, write, and making basic calculation, which means more or less according to that standard, the standard at that time meant 2 classes. Compulsory education was until after the Second World War. Then it was the Second World War. Then it changed, and it passes from the second year of elementary school to 5 years of elementary school, and then it passes to what we call 3 years after elementary school, and now 16 years old must be the age at which a children go to school, and it is compulsory. Okay. Now I mentioned the fact that other than the choice related to the dynamic decision, there is a mix of elements that justifies the intervention, government intervention in terms of failures on the one side that are related to issues of externality and merit or demerit good. What about the first point, externality? Of course, we can find a classification of externalities on the consumption side, which means that the person or group of persons which originates the externality is a consumer of certain goods and services, that produces externalities simply because it consumes certain goods and services. It's okay. And as we did for externalities on the production side, we can have exactly the same classification, including atmosphere, external economies of consumption, or specific technological externalities of consumption, or pecuniary atmosphere pecuniary externalities of consumption. But this is not the point. The point that you have to understand is that we, not we, the government might be interested in this kind of situation for the simple fact that the consumption of some specific goods, which is merit good or superior or the like, determines an external effect on all the other members of the collectivity. For instance, what about education? Why did you choose to study this course in Rome? I think you can answer. Which kind of consideration entered in your decision when you decided to make this course? Notice that MA is a kind of superior good because it's high level of education. So your decision is involved. Your decision of study for MA here is a decision involving exactly what we are talking about today. Why did you choose to come here? Or to continue to study after your initial courses?
Because of the ranking of the university.
Because studying pick up.
To study from this university because of the ranking of this university.
That's all. You didn't like this. You could have done anything else, but just you wanted to be at Sapienza.
No, because I already decided I want to study, but to choose the university is because of the ranking of the university.
Any other answer?
For me, because my job, my occupation was related to the discourse.
Occupation related to the course. Another answer was the university ranking of Sapienza. Any other idea? I think you can't say why you are here now. At home, does anybody know why is studying an MA at Sapienza in health economics? Hello, it's not a rhetoric question.
I decided to go in Sapienza because I know and I
It's
knew.
not the point of Sapienza. The point is an MA course, which is considered quite a high level of education. Why you didn't stop studying after first undergraduate course?
Because I wanted to learn more and gain access to higher paying jobs.
Good. Any other answer?
At the end, I think did the admission.
Any other? Well, what you didn't know at the time, possibly, or you did not even think of something different, something like this, that your choice to go on studying after the first undergraduate course, well, it's something that you choose for your individual preferences, opportunity of gaining more possibly doing something that you like. But what you didn't know that, and it can be shown if you look at data, all those countries which have a high number of higher degree students, well, not students, that have finished university with the university, are exactly those whose GDP grew more than others. So unexpectedly, your decision was of some help for your country of origin if you go back to that country or if you stay here, for those who are from abroad, are unexpectedly producing an external effect to all the country because it can be shown, and it has been done for at least almost all the OECD countries, that those who have a higher level of education, and Italy is not so good at this, for instance, we are very low in the standard for the highest education. Anyway, those countries having a number of individuals who have finished university courses are those whose growth is at top level with respect to the other. So there is a positive external effect on all the collectivity. And something like this also happens for the standard of health. This was an issue that was quite often mentioned during the pandemic. I don't know your countries of origin, but in Italy there was a very strong debate in the first period of the pandemic on whether we were locked down, and the issue was, but we have to open again. But the point is that if you open again, people die. And if people die, what apparently seems to be good, because you have quite a short period of economic activity that starts again, then it becomes even worse than before because the virus circulated. And indeed, up until the vaccination was not aware, it was not possible because any time that we try to open again, you have to keep the mask anyway. The problem was that people who are not healthy cannot walk, after a while, cannot walk, and even the last results from it even worse than what expected. What we are talking about this issue, I will give you a sort of framework to study these things, mentioning which are the important things in this part. And at the end, we start concentrated on a part which is very important for health, and which is called the health economics of bats. Bats are the merit good, those good that we should not be consumed by a rational consumer. It is a branch of health economics which is quite important. It is also important for government intervention, and we will see how. But now what we are going to do is try to classify the kind of goods and services that can be involved on market failure on the demand side. And there are different kind of goods. Some of them are so-called normal. Normal means that are good that you can buy in the market, but that for some reason they can be considered of some importance for the collectivity simply because of external effect. There are also another number, quite more important than the other, of goods, which are considered superior. But superior not in the standard way in which economists consider a good to be superior. Have you ever heard of superior goods? What do you understand when I say superior goods? Well, I think you understand when I talk about normal goods, or those that normally you can buy in the market, okay, given your budget. Okay. But what do you understand if I'm talking about superior good in the market? Because there are different ways of talking about that. Any idea of superior good? No.
They're not necessity of life.
This is the standard way in which you can find a definition of superior good. I think you meant, I'm not sure about it in case you correct me, you say those kind of goods that you buy when you are rich.
You can relinquish when you want to dip into things. Superior one is not necessary, and the goods that you can move on in your life.
I'm not sure I understood. I try to translate in my understanding. Superior goods are those that can be bought when your income is of a certain level. Is that what you meant? You buy superior goods as a consumer if your income is of a certain level. Because, for instance, let's say you think that you are hungry and you buy food or the basic. Then if you become rich, you switch to high quality, more expensive food. This is a kind of the definition of superior food. It simply means that a way to look at this food is that simply look at the elasticity of the goods with respect to income. And in all those cases in which the elasticity of this good with respect to the income of the consumer is positive, you start consuming this kind of good. So it is as if you are poor, you have a basic for your survival, but then you are increasing your income. You are moving to more expensive things that maybe you won't need. This is not exactly the case I'm talking about today. What another way of looking at superior food is not simply related to elasticity of demand with respect to income, but to a different way in which consumer appreciate or not that food. Is a matter of preferences. This is another branch of the literature. It means that there are a number of goods, like, for instance, knowledge, arts, scientific knowledge in particular, which are, you can appreciate that they are important, but you are not fully aware of their importance unless you know how to consume this kind of good. And this is more or less related even to your experience as students. When you just think of your different steps when you were young, you won't possibly think of being here now studying health economics, but simply because you didn't know. No? Then by knowing things, you can start appreciating that that kind of consumption, and you address your interest in a specific way of consuming knowledge. but simply because you have learned how to consume knowledge. And this process is said to be superior because it's not reversible. It's exactly why, like the situation in which you learn to read. But first you learn an alphabet. Then you learn to put the letters together. But then when you have learned to read, it's not reversible. You cannot stop doing it if you look at even a signal that whose alphabet can be recognized. And the non-reversibility of this process makes, in most cases, this good superior on the side of preferences of consumers. It means that the preference changes over time, and we go back to the dynamic decision. Why? It's like the Socrates parable. If you learn, the more you learn, the more you are unsatisfied, but you cannot go back and regret of not being illiterate, simply because you have learned how much you can learn in the world, and the process is not reversible. What does it mean from an economist point of view? This situation means that unlike those preferences set for normal good, which do not change, because you have your possibly every day you have the same utility of having lunch or dinner, and after a certain point, when you are saturated, you cannot eat more, even if you like very much the food, because you cannot explode by eating and eating and eating. But what happens in the case of preferences for superior good is that as the time passes and the more you learn, the more your utility curve increases over time for the same level of consumption. It means that, for instance, if today you have, I'll make a picture of it. So assume two good. X is, no, assume just one, is a superior good. This is the marginal utility of good X. And we have a standard marginal utility function, which is decreasing, because it is decreasing at the moment t 0. But if I'm going in this direction, and put different point of time, so t1, t2, and the like. It might be over here, something like this. What happens? Look, today, the consumption of X bar, this gives an utility equal to O bar. Okay. What happens after a while? It might be next year. If this was education or knowledge or the like. So look at what happens if I increase X. No, I keep X and look at utility. Put it there. So I keep X fixed. It's always X bar. And what happens after 1 year? It happens that at time one, the utility might be higher. And for instance, like this, where you see that this distance at time zero is lower than that at time one. So superior good are those showing a marginal utility increasing over time. It is decreasing in the same time because you cannot explode with knowledge, but the next year your expectation of the utility from, say, knowledge is higher for the same quantity that you consume, and then it can become even higher at time two, where time two we change the color and we have with this the same level of x. It gives an utility that might be even higher than the original. So, as the time passes, the same level of consumption of a superior good gives you a marginal utility which is increasing. Can you see the point? Any question about this? Now, go back the classifications which are in a way linked to externalities, and we look at the classification of why which are the reasons why we found ourselves in the situation of choosing this kind of making the wrong choice. And the main reason that have been found in the literature are those related to a kind of weak willpower of individual, or something that in ancient Greek was called akrasia, which means weak willpower, by the way, which induces individuals not to make the right decision at the time in which they have to take that decision. A second reason is related to short-sighted view of individuals. Individuals in general are those taking standard decisions, are those who are mainly involved with the short horizon or people linked or close to them. So any time that we look at the decision of individuals, we can really say that their preference go more strongly, is more intense for short-time decision and sort of myopic behavior, or if the decision involves other people, they are involved with those who are for some reason related to them. Otherwise, the interest might be low. If you look at the war, for instance, Putin made the same things in Syria, but now Ukraine is much more close to Italy and Europe, and the disaster is perceived as criminals. But he did exactly the same in other part of the world. But we are not so involved, even if the situation was exactly the same. And the third point that justifies this kind of failure is uncertainty or asymmetric information from consumers about the decision they are going to take. Now, we look at each of these points individually, and the first, which is related to weak willpower of individual or akrasia, is related to the story of The Ulysses story, possibly you have heard about it. And the story is that of Ulysses tied to the mast when he wanted to listen to the siren song. I think you know the story of Ulysses, that really sailor wanted to go to Ithaca and was traveling in ship. And he knew that at a certain point, he was informed by Circe that at a certain point he would have met the sirens. And the siren song was something that was incredibly good, something that he wanted to know, strongly wanted to know. And there is an amount of literature about the Ulysses' desire of following knowledge. So he wanted strictly, strongly listen to siren song. But everybody knew that at least those who had listened to siren song would have followed the sirens and died immediately, because following the sirens meant death. So what happened with the crew and the ship? Well, with the consent of the crew, because otherwise they could have not done it. The decision of following knowledge, which is the superior good. So Ulysses is also considered an important symbol for constitutional political economy. He decided that the sailor would have paths put on earth so that they could not listen to siren song, and they were not attracted to follow the sirens. And he, Ulysses himself, was tied to the mast. And being tied to the mast without paths on earth would have put him in the position of listening to the siren song. But at the moment of the weakness of willpower, it would have not been in the position of following the siren simply because he was tied to the mast. And it is more or less the situation that we found with compulsory education or all those rights defined for health in the Constitution. Given that possibly the constituents knew the fact that individuals are in charge of taking decisions which might not be easy to be followed, the constituents decide to put a strong constraint so that at the moment of weakness, they would have not been in the position of saying, well, I won't do it now. And so in fact, when he was in the position of listening to the song and following silence, he was not able to follow them. And this is one of the stories that notice doesn't mean that the good in question, which might be superior, is of the type of public good, even global public good. They are most often the case, but if you look at education, education is not necessarily a good, a public good, because if you look at the condition in which a public good is characterized, either global or not, you can simply see that education is a mixed good in most cases, or private in particular. And for instance, there are a number of countries in which education is provided. The second point that you have to consider in this situation is the short-sighted interest of individuals. And this is very often a situation that affects the choices of consumers for which they would be in the position of regret after the choice. In general, individuals do not consider in the same way the future as they themselves as future subject would consider it at the same time. What I mean that when we are in the dynamic decision, we are in a way not the same person. If I'm deciding today for my pension scheme or for my health insurance scheme, if I was in a different country, I would see the world in a completely different way depending on my age. At the age of 20, I would look at the world of health, pension scheme, and the like in a completely different way with respect of a person who is 15 years old, 50, or 70 years old, or the like. And this makes a difference when individuals take decisions. And this is another case in which we say that because of this attitude, subject decision must not be time consistent. But as you can see, the situations are interlaced with each other, and the story of aprasia is very often related to the story of myopic behavior of individuals. The third point that I mentioned, which is quite important, is that related to uncertainty and or asymmetric information, which is related to decision to be taken about superior good. And this is quite important for health because it does not only include those goods like which kind of MA are you choosing, which kind of school you want to make. For instance, after you have finished MA, you can be enrolled in a doctorate. And assuming that you are interested in a very specialistic part of your course of studies, that you want to study more, and possibly you want to make your doctoral thesis exactly on this very specific point, which is the information that you have on where to study that topic at the top, which is the university in the world that offers you exactly that kind of knowledge that you are looking for your doctoral degree, which is a quite important part of the course of studies of an individual who doesn't want to stop. Or for instance, another situation that another kind of asymmetric information or uncertainty from the point of view of consumer is related to medicine. So in general, you can look at any good as something that you can prove directly. Is good or bad. You might have shoes. Are they good or bad? And you work properly as you expected or not? And you can try it. Or you go at the restaurant and look for the restaurant and then assuming certain categories for the choice. You search and then you find the good, and in case you go back again if you like it. And these are those kinds of food which are normally exchanged in the market. But there are a number of goods like scientific research or medicines in principle, for which experiencing the quality of the good itself that you want to consume is very expensive. So just think of the situation in which you need paracetamol because you have flu. You need paracetamol, but there is nobody which is in the position of guaranteeing that the exact quantity of active principle that you need is inside that pill. And anytime that you need paracetamol, you have to have a chemical examination or go to a laboratory just to verify that this is the right pill that you want and it helps. So also in this situation is very likely that you need someone that guarantees the quality of the good that you are consuming. Like for instance, what he mentioned, the quality of the educational system. So you know that if you want to study something, you might discover that someone in the world, some university in the world is offering you the position for doctoral thesis that is exactly on the topics that you want to study. But you have to look also at the educational quality that that school is providing you. And on this basis, you make the choice. And the guarantee that if you know exactly what you want in that university must be done by someone else, because it would be very expensive for any of you choosing by directly testing the quality of a given university. And the amount of cost, by the way, is even more high. It's higher for all those goods related to superior merit goods, including culture, scientific research, and the like. And this is, it depends on the kind of preferences that can be formed, because when we are in the presence of the good I mentioned here, what individuals do and their preferences are can be of two. There are two types of preferences. There might be a scale ranking for each individual, that learning how to consume a given good changes continuously its ranking of superior good with respect to other goods that he can consume under the constraint of the budget. And the other issue to be considered is again related to preferences, and it involves the higher ability to obtain utility by the same consume of the good. And over time, individuals are involved in the consumption of certain goods that can give them higher utility as the time passes and they learn how to consume. So there is a matter of ability of increasing utility. This is very often related to the state of health of a country or of an individual. And there is the ability of appreciating the higher utility that is given individually by the same quantity of the consumption, simply because you have learned how to consume a given good. And if you revert the reasoning that I have just gave you, we can easily pass to the consideration of the merit good, where that case, we are again in a quite strange situation from the consumer decision point of view with respect to standard economics. Why? Because we are in the evidence, there is evidence that individuals are consuming and like to consume and choose to consume, aware of what they are doing, goods that are bad for them. So it's something like an asimov, kind of demerit. And this is so important for most countries that there is a branch of health economics that is called health economics of arts. And it is related to all those goods which shows some form of demerit, which means that the consumption of arts is something that gives negative consequences for health. And there are some categories which are very important, so important that the OECD is dedicating important part of its report on health of the differences between most various countries in the consumption of these parts. What I'm talking about, well, before when I was talking about superior good, I mentioned knowledge, I mentioned art, education, and the like. In this case, the level is decreasing. I'm mentioning cigarette smoking or consumption of illicit drugs or consumption of alcohol or junk food or gaming, electronic gaming, or a number of things related to gaming, electronic or not, is producing some problems. What is the point here? You have simply to reverse the reasoning, because we are in a world that a competitive system in which we accept as an assumption rationality, and mainly we accept the market through a kind of consumer sovereignty. But in those situations, we have something that is contrasting. Those which might be considered the rational choice of a consumer. Why should I smoke if I know that, for instance, cigarette smoking increases the possibility of having cancer or cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease like asthma or whatever with respect to non-smokers? Or why should I drink alcohol if I know perfectly that the number of deaths every year at any age for alcohol are even much higher than those for car accidents not generated by alcohol, but OSs are much higher than people dying for HIV or whatever things are of any cause of death, and is possibly much higher than that, much lower than that due to alcohol. Or the same of course for what I mentioned before, cigarette, alcohol, illicit consumption of drugs. Notice that I will show you some data about what happens now in OECD countries, but they are generally, I said, the point, the top part of an iceberg, because illicit consumption of drugs is very difficult to be measured, given that not being illicit, people have to declare the consumption that they have. And there are surveys that are done by OECD, that the OECD organization, that for knowing the basis of voluntary responses of individuals, which is the consumption of substances that are not legal in their country, like cocaine or cannabis in most countries, OECD countries. And even in that case, it's very difficult to be measured, but we already know that the consumption of cocaine, for instance, might be very dangerous for a number of diseases that are related to the consumption of drugs, or even psychiatric diseases that can be considered. And another point which is becoming quite relevant recently is the consumption of junk food. The consumption of junk food, which means all those food containing an excessive amount of fat, sugar, and salt, and the like, which induces obesity, is something which is becoming a problem for a number of countries, given that there are two features that are emerging now. One is that the consumption of junk food begins very early. I would say when we are talking differently from cigarettes or alcohol or illicit drugs, it happens when we are dealing with child after 3 or 4 years, which is a kind of drug to make children quiet. So if you give them food, they are happy or sad in some cases, but the consequences in these cases is that they start to generate a situation that might become dangerous. They become obese in some situations, but not only, they are more prone to having diseases related to cardiovascular problem or heart attack, heart stroke, and the like. Notice that we will see also data quite often. Junk food, which is providing an enormous amount of calories in a small quantity, is consumed by a very much positively related to poverty. The higher the level of poverty, the higher the consumption of junk food. And this is a quite interesting situation, because it acts as a sort of substitution for alternatives of the style of life. And given that it is often not so expensive, the situation can be more dangerous in those for those children coming from less affluent households. And the last thing that I want to mention, that I show you some data on it, what at least the OECD is saying about it, is gaming. Gaming is considered now be a problem for at least developed countries, and it is a kind of drug. People cannot stop gaming when they start. Not necessarily for gambling. It is not only a point of losing money because you like gamble. It might be a kind of addiction that is related to gaming with internet or the like. But it is so important that now, about 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, for instance, in Italy, the branch of most important hospital in Turin, which is called the Le Molinette, opened a branch where people can go to try a sort of support or cure for this kind of addiction. And it is this kind of addiction is also spread in Japan very often and quite often in China. I don't know where is the reasoning behind this kind of addiction, but more or less it works exactly like a drug, impairing a normal life in the best case, and disaster, financial disaster for the families of those who are involved in whose members, for those families whose members suffer of this kind of addiction. Well, before we are looking at some picture related to this, to the health economics of bats, in particular those coming from the last report of the OECD country, which is of 2020. This is not a year report because the people reported come from survey, which is done every 40 years. I don't remember exactly, which is not, anyway, that is not the new one, the new report already, which all the figures I was saying are based on what individuals declare about the consumption of fats. And the picture is quite interesting. And the issue that must be considered are of different kind. And so exactly on that, you are required, if you want, to choose about one month, which one you prefer to consume or not. Or study, simply study, no, it's not consume the bath that you choose. And look at whether there is in a country that you choose some kind of intervention that government can do with respect to, in order to increase the standard of health determined by that fact. Why I'm saying so? Because, well, when we study about, I'll be back on this issue and just anticipate. Economic theory offers two different approaches. One is the approach studying the individual behavior with respect to that. Why should I consume something that I know perfectly is dangerous for health? There is nothing rational. I do smoke. I know perfectly. I cannot stop. I don't want to stop. I know perfectly. I'm very informed, well informed by the number of relatives which are doctors every time. All this like the worst disaster of cigarettes. But I continue to smoke. Now, how can economists approach this issue? One is from a personal point of view. Why do individuals continue to smoke? Why there is this sort of addiction? What is the levels that induce individuals to consume something that they know is very dangerous for their health? And in this respect, there are part of the theory is devoted to study the consumption of these fats with theoretical model of addiction that explain how individuals cannot change their habits if they're present there, with respect to dangerous consumption. This is not our point of view, as you can understand, because even if you have been informed that if related to the preference of individuals, there can be model of addiction that can explain the individual behavior, but in this course we are interested more on public finance of health economics or health system. Well, so even that parts have a stronger positive external effect on the society, or they might be considered a strong demerit good because it generates a spanning consistent preference, at least in dynamic decision. What we want to look at is exactly what government should do in order to contain, if there is this necessity to prevent the consumption of something that is so dangerous for the health of individuals. Notice that this issue is very controversial. For instance, if you look at the story of all the public finance measure against to combat junk food, because there is a very serious problem, mainly in the United States or in a number of European countries. It's a problem because, first of all, it cannot be very well calculated. What is dangerous? When can you say that an individual is obese and so it's risky, it becomes at risk? So obesity can be measured just looking at the so-called body mass index. The body mass index is an index that considers various parameters, and you should calculate it. And for instance, if the body mass index is over 30, number 30, I don't know exactly, it means that that individual is at the risk of even death or diseases related to the fat. And what states can do in order to reduce these diseases, because this is quite dangerous, is of public interest, because everything that is not any bad situation that could be prevented by behavior that can be corrected is very expensive from a public finance point of view or the health system point of view. If you think at how much the American government spends for obesity, simply for the cure of all those diseases determined by junk food when it is started, mainly when it starts with children. Even in a country where the health system is in most cases private, you can easily understand that it is becoming a problem. So what the government can do in this situation? The same of course for cigarettes, for instance, or alcohol. In the presence of junk food, which means all those foods which are associated with calorie-dense food, like high level of sugar, salt, fat, saturated fat, not all fats. Government can often try consumption of of those food. And for instance, in the last 15 years, there is a number of countries have taken a measure in order to address consumer behavior with respect to food. For instance, the United States, not all over the country, but depending on different states, for instance, California, New York, used the taxation in order to reduce the consumption of some goods considered bad for health. And the same happened in European countries, for instance, Denmark, which it was in 2011, when the government decided to introduce taxation of all those food which had a percentage of fat over, I don't remember the figures, which was not very well appreciated by the population, mainly because it was eating most of the food consumed by Danish people, for instance, which are strong consumers of fat coming from milk and butter and cream. And so it was this kind of measure was considered sort of under the deliberate translation of habits of Danish people. And after 1 year, the government decided to eliminate taxation. Another country that made quite a strong measure against junk food. No, today I'm talking about junk food. It was anyway Hungary. Hungary put taxation for a number of foods. It was the widest group of food taxes for healthy, in order to induce healthy plan of consumption. But even in that case, the population considered this kind of measure more oriented to gain revenues than to induce food consumption habits. And indeed, taxation, excise taxation, is one of the principal way in which government can intervene in order to address consumer consumption. And we will look at taxation under this perspective. And in order to see whether it might work as deterrent of unhealthy behavior. Notice that, however, exactly for food, the attitude is very different, because apparently some experience shows that taxation is not a good way to address consumer preferences. And what it is considered more effective is a kind of policies that is called traffic light policy, which means using the label of the food in order to signal with red, yellow, and green light how much healthy is the food that you are buying. And notice that is determining now, for instance, at the European level, which Europe like to standardize everything among the member states. It's becoming a kind of form, because, for instance, if you consider cheese, the Danish government considered something that is not healthy, because it contains quite a high level of fat, and this is dangerous you are penalizing with red light all those foods, a number of foods coming from Italy, which are considered from a different point of view on excellence. Or if you consider wine dangerous, alcohol dangerous, in any case, and you label the wine not only in the standard way, but also with red light, indicating that it is very dangerous for health. You are in a way penalizing all those countries producing wine, amongst other Italy, or cheese. The north of Italy is producing and exporting a number of cheese all over the world, which would be highly penalized by this measure that is considered quite good for health. So what you are expected to do if you want to do this the essay on this part is choosing a path. Look at a country that you can choose among those who are taking measures, or for instance, you can also consider the measures taken or addressed by the directive of the European Union in order to see whether the measures taken and the policy are of some effect on the consumption of these goods. But we will be back on it, on this issue next time, and looking at what happens in the OECD countries and how different taxation, different form of instruments can be used in order to change consumer behavior. And this will happen. I have 3 lectures left with you, then I start again with Ricardo. And the next time we will finish the part of government failures with economics of funds, and then failures on demand, joint demand and supply side. And then I will leave the last 2 lectures, my 2 lectures, on explaining how taxation, excise taxation works and can be used as an instrument for regulating the behavior of individuals in the market. Okay, but now I suggest you to start thinking, also looking at the chapter of the book, the number of the chapter, Holland, Goodman, but which is the chapter? Chapter 23, which is on the health economics of banks, where we look, you can see, broadly explain the 2 models, addiction and taxation, for dealing with ads. And then start considering if you want to do it, but you have a wide choice, because there is also the part that has to be done on fiscal surveillance. You choose a good, a budget, and see, for instance, the experience of a given country. You can find also in that chapter some references if you are interested to look at it, or might look even more recent experience of other countries. Notice that, for instance, policy, strong government policy against bad are those done by northern countries, or where the problem of alcohol is very much important for the health of the country. And the same, of course, also for cigarettes, even though Italy is now increasing the price of cigarettes, but not even on price at the level so high like UK, United States, or Scandinavian countries. Quite interesting are also those measures against junk food. In this respect, Italy is very hasn't done anything, almost anything. There was, before the pandemic, a measure that aimed at taxing the plastic bottle used for sugar. What they call it? Sugar drinks or something like. But that measure, that given that was eating a peculiar sector of the economy, by the way, only concentrated in Emilia-Romagna, which is a region of Italy, was considered a kind of discriminatory law, and then joined with the pandemic that measure that was required by government Renzi was cancelled. I think it was cancelled completely. And you can also look at the policy that different countries are doing with respect to the use of these drugs. It's quite differentiated. Either for the kind of drugs that individuals can consume, because something you have to consider separate, should be considered separately, those high consumption of cocaine with respect to cannabis, or with respect to all the chemical hallucinogenic substances which are not controlled even for the effect, because they exit in the market are completely out of control. Anyway, when you have decided, you can choose one of those if you like. And then at the end of the course, I think at the end of May, those who have everybody had to make his own presentation or having of the essay, which is a part of the exam. And I know people is expected to have something like more than half an hour to explain to all the class. It is on funding on this issue, but we will enter into more details next time. Okay. But in case we have some days, if you want to look at that chapter and see if there is something that interests you, and there is some countries that for which public finance measures are being so too strong, you can start looking at it. Okay. Any question? Even at all?